Do you guys mind, like, moderate speed? Cool.
I was gonna say, you guys know how I feel on that, so.
Yeah. Oh, right. That's true.
Yeah.
So not too fast.
Okay, everyone ready?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I'll let you know if it's too fast. My tolerance for speed doesn't seem like anything is like not super high, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go, as an off-time roadmap, just gonna go over like definitions, plan, advantages, and then end review, okay, or impacts. Okay, start time now. Okay, so the resolution we are here today to debate is that NATO should send troops to Iran to commit or to combat the ISIS or Islamic State. First of all, this is a policy round. Obviously, the use of the word should implies that it's policy. Second of all, it should be weighed on net benefits. This decreases judge intervention and is fair to all respects. Definitions are all contextual unless asked in this speech. So, going on to inherencies. First of all, the Islamic State currently has a position to take Mosul, and if they Mosul, sorry, and if they take the city over the, or they already took the city once, basically. So this is going to lead to Iraq troop. What?
Yeah, the Islamic State's in a position to take Mosul.
Yeah. Next.
Is there a prompting? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no troops. There's no troops in the region they're currently going to stop.
Okay, so they already took this city once. Second of all, there are currently no troops in the region, meaning that we don't have a way to combat them currently. Third of all is that Iraq is focused on other areas rather than Mosul, yeah.
Is the speaker aware that as of March, the Iraqi army seized large parts of Tikrit, putting them on the border of Mosul to defend it?
Yes, however, this is not enough currently. They're not doing anything to solve that. Anyway, the plan is that NATO should send 10,000 ground troops to secure Mosul from the Islamic State as well as surrounding areas. Agent, actor, and enforcer are all, or agent, actor, and enforcer. Time frame is immediately. Actor, enforcer, and funding are normal means, yes.
And the United States will be heading this, or what's the division of troops?
Normal means.
Normal means. NATO already has a process through which it recruits troops from these different agencies, from different countries. Anyways, going on to solvency. So, first of all, 10,000 troops is plenty. We see that currently ISIS does not have that many troops. 20,000 is the best estimate, and these troops are under-equipped, don't have the supplies to fight the modern military that we can have there. Second of all, this is mostly guerrilla fighting in the region, so the US with its modern technology, NATO countries with their modern technology can easily combat this. Going on to the first advantage. The first advantage, inherency sub point 1. So, cross-supply that ISIS is already posed to retake the Mosul Dam. This means that they're focusing on fighting here because the Mosul Dam is important. It controls really it provides a lot of the electricity for the region, meaning that they have to focus here because they want to gain control here, meaning they can get power, they can set up a more permanent residency, and overall be helpful. So, the first link, we send in troops. U.S. troops and NATO troops can easily seize the damn city. Look at our solvency. So, when we get what? Yeah.
How solvent were we the last time we went to Iraq?
Last time was completely different. We were fighting groups of insurgents that were basically embedded in the region. Now we're fighting troops and groups that are opposed by the general populace. So ISIS would see this as a signal of U.S. commitment, meaning they would turn them back to Mosul because they know that we can win. They already turned away from areas that we planned on airstriking or that we used airstrikes against, meaning that they see us as a threat. Going on to the internal links. So first of all, this prevents them from retaking the dam. Going on to our impacts. So the first impact is government collapse. The Mosul Dam is key to a lot of Iraq's energy, meaning that ultimately there's going to be a collapse of the Iraqi government if this is ceded, because they will no longer be able to provide energy for their country, no longer be able to provide these needs for their country. And this means that the government would collapse and ISIS would take over. But when ISIS takes over, that's a lot of atrocities. We already see that they are not a human rights-oriented group. This leads to death, beheadings, more systemic violence, and also just a mass number of deaths. Going on to the second impact, which is that of regional interventions, escalating. First of all, going on to nuclear warfare. The impact here is, first of all, regional interventions that would escalate lead to more conflict in the region. More conflict in the region makes it unstable, which inherently leads to a chance of a loose nuke or nuclear weapon. Israel's threatened to strike Iran. Multiple different scenarios that could lead to a nuclear escalation. Basically, that means that you get to nuclear war. Nuclear war leads to extinction, and this is the biggest impact of the round. Extinction outweighs everything else because of probability, other reasons. but nuclear war leads to extinction because it destroys the atmosphere, leading to solar radiation that kills off people, also because it creates a cloud of dust that basically blocks out all light, killing plants. Yes.
So just so I understand your logical reasoning here, you're saying that if the government of Iraq were to fall, that would lead to a loose nuke situation, and that would lead to extinction?
Yes.
Or also possibly a really strike, but yes.
Yeah. Okay, so going on to the second advantage, which is that it would increase NATO credibility. The inherency here is that NATO credibility is pretty low in the status quo. They're doing little in several of the other problems that they have, and they're really not seen as a strong. Russia's not seeing them as a strong threat. They're not really doing much in Ukraine or doing anything in Ukraine. So inherency here is that NATO going into doing this specifically would increase their credibility. They'd be seen as fighting extremist groups. They'd be seen as taking an active part in the world, doing more. This ultimately means that Russia would see them as intervening more, which is very important in the impacts I'll get to. This also would show that the NATO forces are still strong, leading to sort of hedge impacts. But going on to the first impact, first impact is war in Latvia. Currently, Russia is intervening in a lot of places. We'll know that, especially in Ukraine. But Latvia fears Russia and is a NATO member. Now, ultimately, right now, Russia has no reason to believe that NATO would intervene. They see NATO as weak. They've specifically said so. This means that ultimately what we get to is a miscalculation. Russia just decides, oh, NATO's weak, so they go into Latvia. When they go in, this leads to a war against NATO, which leads to extinction because war between Russia and NATO involves multiple nuclear powers, all of which could lead to nuclear escalation because it is a very tense scenario. So we go into that war, sorry, not this time, I have a lot to get through. So we go into that war, we have a war there that escalates, and that gets to nuclear war, which leads to extinction again, finality, the rest of that. Second impact here really is, again, just war. Even if you don't buy the extinction links, there's going to be a war. If they go into Latvia, there will be large-scale war, large-scale fighting leads to lots of deaths. Lots of deaths ultimately will mean that it's not beneficial. Net benefits will kill that. So ultimately, you're going to be voting affirmative because of the huge extinction impacts, also the net benefits and the death that we see in the resolution. For all those reasons, vote aye.
I will go on, then off. Well, framework on.
How many off? 2 off. Do I need a separate sheet for perfect? Or?
No,
We're not running any figure.
Okay. Sounds good.
So did everyone catch that order? Is that a second?
Framing and 2 off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ready? So we agree with my opponent's framework, policy, net benefits, that's fine, and we're going to move straight into the enhancement block. So essentially they give you a few pieces of evidence. I'd like to first point out that my opponents don't cite a single one of their sources or give you a date, and this is going to be crucial in today's debate. This will probably be the first reason why you vote. The reason being, all of my opponent's evidence saying that that the Islamic State is primed to take Mosul and that Iraq isn't going to be successful, all of that evidence is outdated. According to the New York Times on March 10th of 2015, more recent evidence, or at least we suggest to be to more recent, we can see that Iraq has seized a large part of Tikrit, which is the major stronghold of ISIS, and we can see that now currently in the status quo they have around 30,000 troops, which all estimates lead to like even my opponent said 20,000 would be enough. They have 30,000. They all estimates say that this will be enough to be able to accomplish what they want, and also analysis says that they're poised to take Mosul, as they talk about, which is the second largest city in Iraq, meaning that the current Iraqi forces, the argument here is that the current Iraqi forces are already combating ISIS. We don't need this action to take place. In addition to that, we can see that Jordan, with their combined forces in fighting the Islamic State, they have killed approximately 12,000 ISIL members. According to the Pentagon, on March 15th of 2015, 5 days after our New York Times evidence, they estimate that if the status quo is to continue to go on in the way it is with the evidence that we read you, they estimate that this conflict, that the Islamic State will be completed and defeated by approximately 9 to 14 months, meaning the status quo is solving this problem. My opponent's evidence saying that the status quo needs some sort of action is inherently patently false, yes.
Yeah, what has Jordan got to do with the city of Mosul?
Our argument here is that Jordan is making combined forces and overall weakening the Islamic State. So you can use that to respond to my opponent's inherency, and because their inherency solves their entire idea about sovereignty would fall as well. So we can move into their first advantage. They talk about the Mosul Dam, and they say that there is a lot in the Mosul Dam, specifically electricity, and they link this out to a lot of large things. You can cross-apply that entire inherency block there, because all of that responds to it. Essentially what we're saying here is that no, actually, we don't need this intervention to take place. We don't need any more troops. They said that 20,000 is the magic number. Their plan is only half of that. The status quo was 30,000. My opponents have unfortunately not read the news in recent days. Yeah.
We never said 20,000, we said 10,000.
Regardless, we have 3 times as much as that, is what we're saying. But in the status quo, there's 30,000. So moving on, I would like to refute impacts. Their first impact, they talk about how there is going to be They talk about regional intervention. They say that regional intervention leads to instability. This is patently false as well as empirically false. In the status quo as well as empiric history, we can see that regional intervention and regional means of trying to solve a problem is more stable than external means of trying to solve these sort of conflicts. I give you the example of both Libya and the example of Iraq. We can use those to empirically refute that impact, and so that gets rid of their loose nuke scenario and the nuke war impact. Their second about NATO credibility, the argument here essentially was that NATO's going to lose credibility with Russia, and all they impacted this out to was a nuke war with Russia. Our first response is mutually assured destruction. Two large groups, two large bodies with nukes doesn't mean nuke war will happen, specifically using the theory that both knows that it'll be bad, so neither will fire that nuke. But additionally, we're going to turn their argument and say that intervention, specifically by a foreign body, is bad. You can wait for that turn in our case, though. So moving off case, our first disadvantage is lives. Subpoint A is civilian casualties. We can see that ground troops as a method of solving regional problems is the most bloody way for any country to go, let alone a group of countries. Empirically, we looked to Iraq, in which 500,000 innocent civilians were killed, and we can see that as a direct result of our main strategy being ground troops. Additionally, we can see that this is unique to foreign intervention because according to the University of Michigan, foreign intervention is 80% more bloody and has more casualties than regional intervention. The reason being, the people in that region care more about who they keep alive and who they kill. If you take another country or another country's forces, they care less about the civilians there, and they tend to be less careful. And so the impact of this very clearly is lives. We argue that lives is the strongest impact in today's debate because lives are irreversible, whereas hegemony or whatever else they're talking about isn't. Subpoint B is terrorism. Essentially, this problem, this action will perpetuate the problems of terrorism. I'm sorry, I don't have time for your point. Essentially, this action will perpetuate the problems with terrorism. According to the University of Chicago, 96% of all terrorist activity, of all suicide bombings as a result of terrorist activity, were as a direct result of foreign occupation, foreign ground troops and foreign militants being inside of a country, specifically within an unstable country such as Iraq. And so the impact here is that we'll be perpetuating terrorism. Additionally, we can see that according to The Guardian on February 24th of 2015, we can see that they estimate that if NATO is to intervene, specifically with a method of ground troops, as my opponents advocate we do, they can see that the amount of ISIL members will increase by about 300%. They will triple the size of ISIS if they take this step. The warrant behind this is because of the anti-sentiment that this provokes, and the reason why that creates more terrorism is because it is sort of like a tool for recruitment. If people are upset with the United States, they're more willing to recruit and become part of a terrorist organization. We're going to see a large problem with that. The impact is first, the initial lives that are lost, and second impact is the potential for more lives to be lost in the future because you strengthen a large terrorist organization. Our second disadvantage is titled power vacuum. This is the theory that if you were to be solvent and you were to get rid of the Islamic State, you create a severe power vacuum that opens the door for even worse terrorist organizations to fill their place. We give you the empiric examples of what, when Al-Qaeda was virtually defeated. We can see that opened the door for another terrorist organization. All evidence supposes that would be the Islamic State. If my opponents are solvent, what we can see is that the impact will be even worse terrorism and a worse state and more instability. For those reasons, we need it.
Okay. I will go in the order. Let's go app case, the neg case.
On the neg case, are you going to start with framing or the decides?
By framing, you mean inherency?
Yes.
Inherency on top of the app case.
Fantastic.
Yep. So the neg dumped a lot on our inherency, but none of it is going to apply because it's not specific to the scenario that we are ISIL. First of all, they say that Iraq is seizing the city of Tikrit. Irrelevant. The city of Tikrit is in northeastern Iraq, not where Mosul is, which is in the northwest. That's not going to apply to our scenario. Furthermore, they say Iraq has a lot of troops. Also not going to apply because they have conceded, straight conceded, that Iraq's troops have shifted their focus, and that even though there are enough troops, those troops are not being deployed in the right places. This means the outtake.
These troops are, as you say, in Tikrit. Tikrit is bordering Mosul.
That's just not true. They're about 100 miles apart. The focus of the fighting is not in Mosul. Iraq has not been deploying its troops in Mosul, which you conceded in the LOC, I might note. They also say Jordan has killed a number of ISIS fighters, also relevant. Our scenario does not deal with an all-out war to destroy ISIS. Our scenario and our plan is a very targeted conflict, specifically to secure the area around Mosul. That's going to be why a lot of their offense doesn't apply. Furthermore, they say that the war is going to end in 9 months. First response is no warrant. Second response is even if that's true, we're going to be coming first in time frame because we say that ISIS is seized, poised to take the Mosul dam right now. Extend the damming analysis that says the Iraqi military has shifted its focus to other parts of Iraq, which means that even if they win, that there are enough troops, those troops are not putting their efforts in the right place. Advantage 1, they cross-apply on the inherency. I've already answered that argument. I'd like you to extend the government collapse scenario, which they didn't touch at all. This is an impact scenario. They didn't answer this impact scenario at all, where we specifically say that the Mosul dam is key to 40% of Iraq's energy, that the loss of that energy means the government would collapse, and that the collapse of that government means ISIS would take over the region and lead to atrocities. They didn't answer that. Can extend that impact, that's going to be a very major impact. On our second impact about regional intervention and escalation, they say that regional intervention is better than foreign intervention. That's not grappling with our scenario. What we are saying is that in a world where the Iraqi government collapses, which they just conceded will happen, if the result of that would be that regional powers would get involved, and that such a war would escalate, specifically because Israel would probably get involved, could lead to a preemptive strike. All of this analysis is simply dropped because they think we're talking about something else. We're not talking about regional intervention in a scenario to stabilize the conflict. We're talking about the scenario where regional powers fill in after the Iraqi government collapses. All of these impacts go conceded. On advantage 2 about data credibility, they say MAD checks. The first response is they've conceded on miscalculation scenario. We say that MAD doesn't check because Russia thinks that the United States will not intervene on behalf of Latvia. All of that analysis is straight conceded in the LOC. Don't let them try to walk this back in the LOC. They straight concede specifically that Russia thinks the United States will not support Latvia, but that they're wrong and the United States will, which means we have a clear link to miscalculation linked to nuclear war and extinction. They're not putting any defense on nuclear war except to say that it wouldn't happen, which means you're just going to have to assume that when nuclear war happens, it's going to escalate to extinction through the process of nuclear winter, and basically nuclear weapons kick up dust into the air. That blocks out the sun, prevents the growing of crops. That means that everyone dies from starvation. All of this is conceded, means nuclear war leads to extinction. And furthermore, the idea that MAD checks is just not, never mind. The main point is miscalculation. They've considered miscalculation link that specifically says that their MAD check sensors don't apply because this specific scenario is one there's incomplete information. Russia thinks the United States would not retaliate, which is why Russia would go in even though MAD checks. On their first disadvantage about lives, they say that intervention leads to casualties. We say non-unique. There's already a civil war going on in Iraq that is killing a lot of people. Probably means we have a chance of saving more lives as opposed to killing people. In addition, the Iraq War example is not analogous. That was where we intervened to topple a stable government. Intervening to stabilize one small section of a country that is already embroiled in civil war is probably not going to be a very good comparison. For further specifics of our analysis on our plan, as opposed to general statements about why intervention is bad, because none of them are going to apply to a specific plan. The next answer is no link. The plan text that we read is that we will secure the area of Mosul and the surrounding area. This is an area that is currently controlled by Allied forces and that ISIS threatens to take over. So all of the problems with actively intervening and trying to take down ISIS don't apply to us because that is not what our plan does. That is not the goal of our intervention. The goal of our intervention is to secure this area and prevent it from being taken back. It's fundamentally a defensive intervention. They say lies is the biggest impact because it's irreversible. I say extinction is the biggest impact because it's truly irreversible, it's larger in magnitude. On their second subpoint about terrorism, we said the motives for terrorism are inevitable. There's always been a motive for terrorism. Furthermore, the era of U.S. intervention, most U.S. interventions starting after 9/11 is also the era of lowest terrorism, which means its impact is empirically denied. Furthermore, there's always going to be alternative causes for U.S. terrorism that you're not going to be solving. Specifically, the United States is already engaging in airstrikes in the region. Airstrikes are pretty good publicity for the Islamic State. I don't see why intervening is going to have some unique propaganda impact that launching bombs at people isn't currently having in the status quo. In addition, no link, cross-apply from the above, that we do not launch an offensive intervention. All we do is launch a defensive intervention to stabilize the area of Mosul and the dam and prevent it from being taken by ISIS. They also say that we would triple the population of ISIS somehow. I don't see a warrant for this claim. And in addition, cross-apply for above, that we are not actively going out to fight and take down ISIS. All that we are doing is going in and stabilizing a region that is currently controlled by Allied forces, but that ISIS threatens to take control of. This no links us out of all of their offense, means we're going to win on our case. The second disadvantage about the power vacuum, they didn't get very far on this one, but the first response is we do not destroy ISIS. Again, our plan doesn't do that. No part of our solvency says that we're trying to use 10,000 troops to destroy the entirety of ISIS. Probably means you're going to be voting aft because all of their offense is generic, not applicable to the specific plan we read in this debate, which is a plan to stabilize the area around Mosul. All of this offense about what happens when states intervene to take down terrorist organizations or to secure large swathes of territory is not going to apply because that is simply not what our plan does. The second response is, yeah, there are better actors in the region, so even if you believe them that there is a power vacuum and that we somehow take down all of ISIS, which is not a claim either side in this debate is making, that would still not necessarily mean because that bad actors would fill in, because the Kurds, which are a relatively stable government, would likely fill in. The Peshmerga is poised to take control of much of northern Iraq, as well as the Iraqi government and the numerous other forces in the region. There's no probability of that impact. The round breaks down pretty simply. Their inherency doesn't apply to our scenario because it doesn't grapple with the fact that the Iraqi government has shifted its focus, and that even if it has enough troops, it doesn't put them in the right places. All of their disadvantages don't apply because they haven't applied them to the specifics of our plan text. You prefer our specific evidence, our specific solvency, our specific impacts over generic impacts about intervention being bad that don't apply to our case.
Okay. So I will first be going over inherency, aft case, and main case. Oh, and for the record, I am kicking the power vacuum thing. I'm going to go over the first two.
Kicking it? Okay.
Yeah. So everyone's good? All right, great. So beginning time on the inherency block, my opponents had several responses. The first was that our evidence wasn't specific. Perhaps they misheard, but the 30,000 troops to say, as my partner quoted, are poised to take Mosul. These are the words that came directly out of his mouth. These 30,000 troops are poised to take Mosul. We cited the Greek evidence to prove that they are capable of beating ISIS and capable of defending this region just with 30,000 troops alone. But to cite my opponents themselves, they say that ISIL is poorly equipped and poorly funded, so they themselves admit that ISIL is unlikely of beating these Iraqi forces. We can see that, yes, I can't get you right now at this point. I will get you later if I have time. So we can clearly see that they just misread our evidence. These are Iraqi forces, and this is what my partner directly said. I'm sorry that they misunderstood that. But additionally, moving on to the solvency evidence of the Pentagon, they said no warrant. It was from the Pentagon. We read that it was from the Pentagon. Pentagon. But additionally, they say that they solve better, but then they go on later in their case to say that they're not fighting ISIL, they're not solvent. So they're kind of contradicting themselves on this point. We can clearly see that with the status quo is solving the problem of ISIL, we are solving the problem, and we are able to defend Mosul. But even if you don't believe that, and you still believe that it's not specific, we still win the cases, because you'll notice that the main response that they make to our case is, oh, it's not specific evidence. But we can see that we use that generically because it will be true in the situation too. My opponents never give you a reason why this specific region is different. They just say, well, it's held by allies. But let's think about this. Sending the message that we're invading Iraq, even if it's just a part of Iraq, is still going to scare the local Sunni population. We can see that the last time that we invaded Iraq, we instigated a government that was inherently oppressive to the Sunnis. So if we do it again, even if it's a specific region, we still see this recruitment, we still see these generic disadvantages. Yes?
Where are you?
I was going inherency block, but I'm transitioning into your case now, but an observation regarding your general responses.
Okay.
So first, going into the advantages of the AF case. Their first advantage was this idea of ISIL poised to take Mosul. I'd like to point out that they contradict themselves when in their first speech, they say that the city has been taken before, yet we didn't see this nuclear war happen in the first place. So they themselves admit that their impact scenario is very, very flimsy and unlikely to happen. And when you weigh impacts, you have to take into account probability. So seeing as their impact is literally the most improbable thing that can happen, aka nuclear war, we can see that that's not an impact that they can access because they themselves admit that this has happened in the past. But additionally, we can see that with our inherent evidence, we have an Iraqi force that is proven to beat ISIL and is able to take back this region and protect it properly. They also didn't address at all the empirical evidence of Libya and Iraq that we brought up to say that specifically and empirically speaking, foreign intervention is not preferable to regional intervention. In fact, it is actually worse. So you can extend that evidence that my partner gave you that in fact we turn their first contention because they are making the problem worse and because the status quo is solving already. Plus they don't have impacts regarding this nuclear war because as they say themselves, the city has already been taken. Their second contention about NATO basically getting credibility. First of all, extend the evidence that my partner gave you about the mutually assured destruction theory, how essentially Russia, being a country with a lot of people in it, will not want to start nuclear war even if it does expand. So even if we concede miscalculation, they don't access the impact of nuclear war because it simply isn't feasible. They drop the mutually assured destruction argument, but I'd also like to extend with another response that essentially if we already invaded Iraq and the entirety of the Middle East, if Russia didn't respect us that time around, there's no reason why this specific instance is going to be any different. They never give you a clear impact scenario or a solvency scenario in which they can actually solve this problem and make Russia respect us this time around. In fact, if we didn't show that we were invasionist with our last round of invasions, then there's no reason why this would be any different. I'm sorry, I still have my entire piece together, I will get to my time later on. All right, so now going into the negation team's case, excuse me. Essentially, both of our arguments, yes, they were generic looking at historical precedent, but they can be applied to this scenario because, as my opponents don't tell you, this scenario isn't any different. They just say it's specific to this region because it's held by allies, but all of these arguments still apply. Subpoint A is about casualties. Even if the region has allies, it's assumed by them, they say that it will happen, that ISIL will attack. That means that lives will be lost in the crossfire. Essentially, when we have war, when we have foreign invasion, and this is the evidence and analysis that I dropped, when you have foreign invasion, that results in more lives lost. We gave you the University of Michigan evidence saying specifically, ground troops from foreign countries are 80% bloodier than local forces. We gave you the reasoning as well, that local forces care more about the lives of local people than do foreign countries. Therefore, seeing as you're preferring a world in which we have foreign ground troops securing this region as opposed to Iraqi forces, then we can clearly see that the Iraqi forces are preferable because they're far less bloody, first of all. But second of all, we can see that these 10,000 forces that they're sending in would cause a lot of death in the region. They also tell you that it's not unique, that there's killing going on anyway, but that doesn't mean that you should add on to the killing. Just because there is already violence in the region doesn't mean that you want to add to that violence and cause even more civilian deaths. The Iraqi forces are not causing civilian deaths, at least to the degree that these forces would, so we should prefer a world in which we save more lives on average than their plan. Just because there's killing going on, of course there's always going to be killing going on in our world, it doesn't mean we want to increase the amount of killing. Our second subpoint under this was probably the biggest argument in this debate, which is the idea of terrorism. I say biggest argument because it has both magnitude and probability. My opponents claiming that extinction has the biggest argument is incorrect because yes, it has magnitude. Of course, we can't outweigh nuclear war, but it doesn't have probability. Both of the times they try to access this impact of extinction, remember, Russia didn't do it in the past. Or rather, the last time Mosul was invaded, we didn't see this happen. And Russia, if they simply won't do it because of the mutually assured destruction theory that they dropped. So they don't have access to their extinction argument anymore. Therefore, the terrorism argument is now the biggest impact in the round, given that it has both magnitude and probability. Let's go into the reasons of both. They say that, oh, well, there's always going to be a reason for terrorism, but you are giving a bigger reason. And then this is unique to occupation. They try to say, well, drones do this too. Agreed, drones can be a useful tool for mechanism, but when people are physically there, that's when we have even more problems. They just kind of question the 96% evidence that we read from the University of Chicago without actually attacking it at its base. Empirical evidence would imply that when we go in, we have an increase in terrorism. They said, oh, well, there's not terrorism now. Maybe not in the United States, but in places like the UK and other parts of Europe, terrorism rises drastically when the West invades these bodies. We saw that when we started to use ground troops in Iraq, terrorism in the UK rose by roughly 40%. That's from the Telegraph. We can see that in reality, terrorism does go up, if not in these regions, then around the world, when we foreignly occupy, with foreign bodies specifically. It is unique to ground troops, it is unique to the plan that my opponents are proposing, because they are proposing occupation. That's why it's unique. Don't let them get away with just saying, oh, because it's a specific scenario, because it's this region specifically, they don't link in. They link in because Iraq has a large Sunni population that are going to be threatened by this invasion of Western forces. And as this is going to be used as a further recruiting mechanism for ISIL, and we are solvent in the status quo anyway, so my opponent's plan is not needed, we can see that the advantages are falling and the disadvantages still weigh. So for those reasons, I urge about litigation. Thank you.
Order simple, two voters. Starting time. So the first voter is looking at inherency. Inherency plays a very large role in today's debate, and as I started my last speech, we can see that it's a large reason why my opponents don't have a lot of offense. My opponents simply misconstrue the facts, or at least use outdated facts, when saying that we need this intervention in order to secure Mosul. We give you very clear evidence, and my partner extends this as well, that there are currently 30,000 troops in Mosul, and these troops are poised to maintain stability. And we see ISIL as a whole, not just in Mosul, that these troops are so poised and working so well together that they're going to end the conflict entirely in 9 to 14 months. We can see that this problem is solving itself. We don't need my opponent's action in order for the problem to be solved. And additionally, this takes out a lot of my opponent's advantages, specifically with their first advantage when they talk about how if the Mosul Dam falls, then they link that into how we're going to lose electricity, which leads to government collapse, and they lead that to nuclear war. Essentially, anything to get a nuclear war. Essentially, because we get rid of the idea that look, Mosul isn't going to go down in the status quo. These troops are poised to secure Mosul already. We can see that we get rid of those impacts.
So the impact about government collapse was brought up in the first speech, and it was dropped in the first negative speech, as well as the second negative speech, and this is the first time you're responding to it.
I'm not responding to the impact, I'm responding to the link that takes out the impact. All I'm doing is explaining that the impact is gone as the link is gone. And that was made in my
still under cross-application with the panel, obviously, so.
Up to you guys.
We'll take that into consideration.
Okay. So I have 3:45. Do you?
Yeah.
Okay. So starting time. So essentially, we can see that the implications of this inherency argument take out a majority of my opponent's offense, and so we weigh them very lowly, which leads me to my second voter of impact calculations. We have to look to the impacts in today's debate. Unfortunately, my opponent's impacts, as scary as they sound, are highly improbable, and therefore are impacts that we can weigh highly in today's debate. When you look at their first impact, like I talked about, their impacts of nuke war and regional intervention as a result of government collapse, those impacts are highly improbable for two reasons. First, cross-apply the inherency argument that I was making, but secondly, the second reason is something my partner brings up, is empirically this won't happen. He quotes them saying that this has already happened in the past, Mosul has already been taken, and we haven't seen this implication of these terrible impacts, and so there's no reason to suggest that these impacts will happen. Because their probability is so low, we urge you to take that impact off. Their second impact, when they talk about NATO credibility, This was one of the weaker arguments, but we'll respond to it. We'll go through it anyways. Essentially, what they're saying here is that look, NATO's going to lose. NATO needs this credibility and needs to take this action. First off, you can cross-apply everything my partner said about mutually assured destruction. All that argument is still sound. But additionally, we look to the term that my opponents entirely dropped. We turned this saying that look, if NATO intervenes, it's going to make them look worse, and it's going to make them look worse in the international community.
You never raised the turn on this disadvantage. Your only answer was mad checks. This turn is completely new and leaves us only the PMR to respond.
I have this turn on my flow. If I didn't say it, that's on me. But
You said turn, I'll get to it on case, never got to it.
Yeah.
But I'll do it.
Panel.
The panel will consider it.
okay, do I have time to respond to that, or do you want me to start?
Did you just
Like, I can't give you a specific direction because it's a panel.
Okay. All right. So anyways, we can see that my opponent's second advantage has little impact, taking into consideration the mutually assured destruction argument, and also, if I didn't mention it, there was supposed to be a term there, and I did link that in the case. I'm sorry I didn't make it clear though. So we're going to move on to the impacts that we have on the side of the flow for the negation. We can see that these impacts, because they're both probable and have high magnitude, they're higher impacts than my opponent's impacts, because probability is such a big issue for them in today's debate. So for the first one we look at, our biggest one here is lives, but the subpoint A to that was the immediate amount of casualties, lives that we're going to lose because of casualties. Their only response to this was that this is not unique. This is entirely unique, and so as my partner said, this is unique because any amount of occupation and any increased amount of military force means that more lives are going to be lost. And also, my opponents dropped the evidence that we give you saying that foreign troops tend to be 80% higher rates of casualty because they tend to care less about the people they're killing. This is unique to my opponent's case. But if you don't buy that, our largest impact, and the reason why you vote neg today, is because of terrorism. This is unique to my opponent's case. They were right about power vacuum, we kicked it. But terrorism is unique to my opponent's case, because all my opponents are doing essentially is taking action that isn't necessary, as we've proven on the inherency block, and all they're really doing to the status quo is increasing the amount of foreign occupation that exists. And so essentially you can cross-apply all of the impacts that we have tied into occupation. The University of Chicago evidence, the idea that 96% of all terrorist attacks was a direct result of foreign occupation, we can see those impacts to be strong in today's debate. And what we can see here is also the evidence from Guardian saying that the members of ISIL are going to triple. The impact of this is the largest in today's debate, and the reason why you're voting neg, because we have the probability. We've seen this empirically happen in the past, and we have the probability that it'll happen, and the magnitude is large because of the amount of lives that terrorism has taken in the past. For those reasons, show this, we negate.
So, we're going to do case overview, or just like, case overview starting on inherency, the NATO cred, inherency, NATO cred, disadvantages, and then the most advantage last.
Overview on top.
Okay, start time. Yeah. Okay, so the overview. The affirmative case does not link into any of the specific generic arguments that the plan, or that they have to the plan, ultimately mean that this is a defense. Since this is a defensive operation, they're not going to get offense from their disadvantage. I'll get into that more on their specific disadvantage. But first, starting on the inherency. So ultimately, when we look at the inherency, their argument here is just that, oh, it's already happening, it's already happening, it's already happening, we're already going to take Mosul. But ultimately what they miss here is that we already have Mosul. Right now we are in control of Mosul. They say troops are poised to take it back. How can troops be poised to take it back when we don't have it? If you don't believe this, Google it, look it up, it's common knowledge. Ultimately when they say also that troops are poised into Crete to take it over, extend my partner saying that is 100 miles away. They never responded. There's no response to this, and ultimately this means that they don't have control of the inherency. They also concede that Iraq's troops are already shifting to work into Crete to try to fight in the ISIL state headquarters, meaning that they are already conceding inherency, that we're going to have to solve more, and they just basically drop their Jordan scenario, so get rid of that. They say that there's a warrant from the Pentagon saying that we'd be able to solve in 9 months. They didn't bring this up in their first speech. First of all, they never said it was the Pentagon. Second of all, I don't think that statistic's true, but you can look it up. Okay, going on to our second advantage. So first of all, the reasons that NATO credibility is going that way. First of all is magnitude. They concede that there's an extinction impact here. They just say that mad checks, my partner makes the response that miscalculation in the inherency is conceded, and that they shouldn't be allowed to walk back on this. That's a link to extinction, and they never respond that miscalculation will happen. They just extend their mad checks evidence, ultimately meaning that we have a link to extinction, and that's going to outweigh. Second response to that they're already intervening is that they make this response in their second speech. The argument that NATO doesn't need any credibility is new, and second, Mad's not going to check Russia because the inherency says that NATO credibility is low. Ultimately, this means that in the region, they're already viewed as weak, and they drop this, it's conceded. So if they're already viewed as weak, Russia has no reason to believe that Mad checks. They can just go on through this, meaning that we get to extinction there. Going on to probability, they concede links to NATO credibility. This means that you're going to be weighing extinction as the first impact in the round because they concede 100% that NATO is not credible right now. This means that we have a link to war with Russia because Russia does not see them as a credible threat. Ultimately, what this means is that MAD doesn't check. This takes out all of their arguments and they never responded to my opponent's or my partner's argument. Third of all is time frame. Ultimately, our impact comes first because it happens soon. They never provided any time frame on our impacts, but the massive amount of deaths that would be caused even from a small nuclear war that doesn't escalate means that ultimately this is going to be weighed first because of the magnitude and because those deaths are lost irreversibly. Go to the irreversibility of extinction, meaning that NATO cred outweighs because when we have this nuclear disaster, it stops all other impacts in the round because nothing happens after that. Okay, going on to their first disadvantage. Their first disadvantage is essentially about lives. They say that they're not non-unique and that adding deaths is still bad. Instead, my partner saying that it's non-unique, meaning that there's already civil wars in the area and that there's a chance of solvency. If there's even a risk that we might solve for some of these deaths, you should vote AF, because if we're going to save lives, ultimately on the whole, it doesn't matter if we're losing lives in the fight. Second of all, going on to their argument that there's going to be a huge cause of deaths, they really provide no reason that specifically this force fighting or in a defensive stance in Mosul will cause these deaths. That's conceded throughout their case. That's why it doesn't link back to our plan. Second of all, going into terrorism, they concede that this is not unique, meaning that you can't really weigh. It's already happening in the status quo, and we see when there were huge increases in drone strikes against ISIS, there was no increase in terrorism. There has never been an increase in terrorism directly related to intervention. And my partner brings that up in his speech. They straight conceded me, don't vote on that. They bring up a new point about Sunni populations. First of all, this is new in the MOC, meaning we don't have much time to respond to it. Second of all, it's not unique. We're already launching airstrikes. If that was going to frighten the Sunni population and cause huge revolts, that would already be causing it. Extend all of this non-unique. They drop the second disadvantage, don't count on that. So going on to the third advantage about the Mosul dam. So first of all, they argue that the city's been taken before. Before, it wasn't held for very long. Also, this was new in their MOC, meaning we don't have as much time to respond to it. Since it was not held for very long, this means we still have some inherency that ultimately the government could collapse. Note that they don't address this until their second to last speech. They drop a link to the government collapse, meaning the government collapse, ISIS takeover, and that's the second impact to DQ. Vote next, or vote AF. Sorry.
I would prefer AF.
Thank you so much for judging. Appreciate it. Thank you for judging. Thank you so much for judging. Thank you.
Sorry about first. Yeah.
Want to stand outside, stand here.
Whatever.
Okay.